I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Brian Goldstone has written a really important book. It is called There Is No Place for Us. And the subtitle is Working and Homeless in America. And obviously we're taping this at a really intense point in our history and our society. It's a book, though, that has a direct line sort of between Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed on Getting By in America, which is now 26, 27 years, almost 30 years old, and Matthew Desmond's Evicted, and also Andrea Elliott's Invisible Child. The last two we have featured both of those authors on the show before. Brian's a reporter who was in Atlanta. He followed 5 families between 2019 and 22. You were reporting this book, yeah?
Yeah, roughly.
Okay.
About a period of just over about 2 years.
It's a lot of time with a lot of folks. And I really want to start with the people, because you and I live in the world. We don't always have the same conversations, I think, about the unhoused, the homeless. I think this book is really important. I really want listeners to meet the families. And I think you did a great job with the reporting. So can we start with how you met these 5 families?
Yeah, so it was a very long and complicated process of meeting these families. I should probably say that before I began working on this book, I wrote a magazine story for the New Republic that I reported over a period of about 7 months, following a woman named Kokethia Goodman and her children. And that was kind of the genesis for this book. In that story, she, despite her job as a home health aide, was forced out of the rental home she had been living in because it was in this rapidly revitalizing area, and her landlord decided to sell the property and they became homeless. And I began to wonder, like, how many other people are like this in not only in this city, in Atlanta, where I live, but across the country. And I continued to report in different cities around the country. I reported in Northern California. I kept noticing the same thing everywhere. And so when I decided to write a book, it was really because I felt like I had only scratched the surface of this phenomenon, of wrapping my head around how it is that in America today, having a job, even 2 or 3 jobs, is not enough to guarantee like this most essential human need, like a roof overhead. How is that? So my family and I, we had actually moved to North Carolina after I finished that magazine story and moved back to Atlanta when the book materialized. And because I had done so much reporting already on Ms. Goodman and her children, following them to food pantries and church and all these other places they were going to meet with case managers, I already was meeting a lot of other people in that process. And, you know, for better or worse, writing about housing insecurity in America will yield no shortage of families and individuals experiencing this. Like, finding people was not the problem. The problem was really how to find people who are willing to like allow me in with the kind of the depth and, you know, length of time that I knew would be required to really tell their stories with integrity and with care. And some of them I met during the process of reporting that story. Some of them I met on social media, like on these forums for people in need of housing, through like putting out a call to like all the caseworkers and church volunteers and, you know, dozens and dozens of people who are working sort of in the trenches of these issues. I would get a phone call one night like, hey, can you go to this extended stay hotel, this squalid extended stay hotel, and bring this family food? I'm not able to get over there. And that's how I met one of the main families in the book, Michelle and her children. And that was kind of my introduction to that hotel, which ended up being a kind of key location in the book. So it happened in different ways. And there were families who I thought I would be tracking with, who I did for several months. And then it just became clear for various reasons that it wasn't meant to be, you know, in terms of them being featured in the book. So yeah, it was a very, very complicated process.
It doesn't read like a complicated process, though. I mean, the levels of vulnerability that these 5 families showed you and the amount of trust that they placed in you to tell this story properly. There are plenty of times when I'm prepping for the show and I say, well, I read this really quickly the first time, or I raced it. This is not a book that I could race through for all the right reasons. I really had to sit with what was happening. And you've got multi-generational families in some cases. It's so expensive to be poor. It's so expensive to be poor. And sort of the constant push and pull between trying to pay down debt when you don't make a lot of money is the systemic stuff is really...
Or pay for childcare.
Right? All of it.
All these things that, yes.
But I got really invested. And I felt like I really knew who these people were. And sometimes, yes, some of them made decisions where I was like, oh, sweetie, I hope you're going to be okay. Mm-hmm. You and I are going to dance around some details, though, because I do want people to be able to experience the book on their own. But I'm just thinking, there's Maurice and Natalia, and you bring us into their family. And, they've left D.C., they think Atlanta is the place, and they're going to put down roots, and they've got children. And jobs at companies with names people would recognize. Natalia even goes back to school at one point for her associate's degree. I mean, all of the pieces, right? All of the things we're told will help us get the lives we want. And, you will buy your home and all of these things. And it's just, it's bad turn after bad turn, but also occasionally a difference of opinion between husband and wife.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Maurice and Natalia, because I think, in the process of finding the families that I would follow for this book, or who would allow me to follow them, would allow me to enter into their lives in such an incredibly generous way, it felt like also a matter in some ways of making the stories illuminate a different aspect of sort of this larger phenomenon. And Maurice and Natalia, they, whatever stereotypes people might have about people experiencing homelessness, they are not it. They have these, middle-class aspirations. They're Black. They moved back to the South as part of this kind of new great migration of Black, families and individuals whose grandparents and great-grandparents fled the South for jobs and economic opportunity in the North. And, in their case, they got priced out of their neighborhood in DC, their gentrifying neighborhood. And so they come to Atlanta, to this Black Mecca as they know it, as they've heard of it, expecting to fulfill their middle-class aspirations. And they too eventually are pushed into homelessness. And so it felt really important to and they're a 2-parent household, whatever myths and stereotypes we have about, well, this is a problem of single mothers. No, this is a 2-parent household, a stable, committed relationship. Maurice loves his children. He's an incredible dad. And yet, they too are, and I use the language of pushed into homelessness because it wasn't like they just stumbled into it. There were forces that actively were militating against their security. And I think their story illustrates that in a really striking way.
But also the system, and I didn't really understand this until I read your book. The system too, though, if you're using someone's sofa or you're bouncing between friends or whatever, if you're not physically unhoused, if you are not in a shelter or living on the street or living in your car, you are not technically, services are not available to you necessarily. So we've got this entire population that's literally falling through the cracks.
Yeah. The way I describe it is that, what we see on the streets is the tip of the iceberg. It's the little tip of the iceberg poking out, and it's conspicuous and it's visible, and it's often, I'll use the language, attacked, cleaned up because it's in the way of people going to work because it disrupts the image that cities want to present for themselves, in the lead up to a Super Bowl or the Olympics or whatever shiny, glossy kind of image that cities want. Unhoused people are in the way. But what we see on the streets is only the most conspicuous manifestation of a far more pervasive crisis. And all the people I'm writing about in the book are kind of like, to continue with that iceberg metaphor, they're what lies under the water's surface. This isn't like some marginal phenomenon. Like, this is the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness in America. They are out of sight. They are ignored by policymakers. They've been rendered invisible in all of these ways, not just numerically, because they're also not counted in the official homeless census that happens every year. So all of our headlines that make it into newspapers or news radios, homelessness is at this number this year. All of the people I'm writing about in the book are not included in that number. They've been written out. So they've been written out not only of the numbers, but of the very story we've told ourselves about homelessness. And that just is such an important thing to grapple with, because it says that not only is the magnitude and scale of this problem exponentially bigger than we want to admit, as bad as the official numbers are, and the last 2 years, homelessness has been at a record high in America officially. As bad as that official number is, the reality is even worse. And I say that not to catastrophize and say and just have this kind of doom mentality, but I love this James Baldwin quote, not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And so we have told ourselves a story about homelessness and then have designed solutions geared toward addressing the problem that emerges out of that story. And it's just out of touch with the reality. And I think we have to finally confront the reality.
There are members of our population, and I say that as, you and I, fellow Americans. We may live in different parts of the country, but, we are out in the world. And there is a segment of our society that feels like homelessness is, well, a lifestyle choice. Mm-hmm. Or the result of mental illness or addiction, or choices that maybe some of us wouldn't make. I'm not dismissing mental illness. I'm not dismissing addiction. I am not dismissing other situations. What I am saying, though, is this book focuses on people who are doing the things that they are supposed to do. They have jobs. Their children go to school. Their children go to daycare. They are doing the things that they are supposed to do. And yet still, for simple lack of housing, this problem gets compounded in ways where if you can't, one of the families, the electric meter in their building is so off kilter that they're getting bills for $700 a month. And it's in a one-bedroom apartment. And it's things like, okay, maybe you have a $700 a month electric, and the electric company is kind of like, well, that's what the meter says. And this person is saying, well, actually, what is going on? And it's this wild catch-22.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, there's so much to say about that. One thing is that, in her case, the person's name is Kara in the book. I use pseudonyms to protect their privacy. But Kara, at this point in the story, this apartment that she's living in, when she's getting not 1 month, but month after month after month of $500, $600, $700 electric bills for this tiny little apartment. And this is after she's been homeless with her kids. This is her getting housing finally. And, we should put housing in quotes because it may be a roof over her head, but it's not, there's nothing stable about it. And so this is after her journey of homelessness. She's in this apartment and she feels like she's going crazy with these bills. And, you mentioned mental health issues and addiction issues and substance use. One of the reasons it was important to follow these families over such a long period of time was because if you just capture them in a moment, you would have a lot of misconceptions, perhaps. You would you wouldn't understand, you would begin to mistake symptom for cause, all sorts of things. And in her case, when I first met her, she was a very different person. I think she would say that herself than she was by the time the reporting concluded, because these, like, imagine what it's like to wake up and find another bill that you're unable to pay, that's going to threaten your housing, that's going to cause your lights to be turned off. And in her case, she ended up sleeping in her car with her kids while all of the food in her refrigerator spoiled in the apartment that she had just paid rent on because these bills were so high and she couldn't pay them and her lights got turned off. It's just like, it will drive you mad. And another family in the book, when we meet them, the mom, Michelle, is like preparing Christmas Eve dinner for her kids. And by the time the book ends, she's in the throes of alcoholism. And that was a process of getting there. That was a process of being so beaten down and so demoralized and rendered destitute by all of these external forces. But if you just met her at the end of that process, you would see someone who is essentially living on the street and drinking themselves into a stupor. But you don't know what caused her to get to that point. So widening the lens in terms of the time spent was really important to get a full sense of like what causes people to fall into these situations.
And also 2 years is a real reporting commitment. It's not like you sort of dropped in. I say this all the time about Matt Desmond. When he was working on Evicted, he actually lived in that trailer park in Milwaukee. It's not like he hopped into his Honda and drove back to wherever he was living. He lived in one of those trailers and had the giant hole in his floor. And I mean, you were there doing the reporting. You were taking part in the census in January of 20, doing the head count for those who were actually living on the street. And I have to imagine, though, because you are a human being, it takes a toll.
Yeah. I mean, the reporting method really felt a lot like ethnography. Matt Desmond is a sociologist. I'm an anthropologist by training. And this reporting definitely felt more like the field work that I did in West Africa for many years. I worked in northern Ghana doing field work, and anthropological field work is, or should be, inherently immersive. It's inherently sort of boundaryless. You don't know necessarily, or you shouldn't know what the story is or what the argument is before you have been thrown into the world that you are interested in learning about. And that was definitely true in my case. It wasn't just the amount of time. It was like I was just with them as much as humanly possible. And it was absolutely crushing. It was absolutely crushing. I think I'm still trying to make sense in some ways of like what that was like. And part of the way I make sense of it is by just hearing what it's been like for them. It's hard for some of the families I wrote about to even talk about what they went through, much less read about it now, like in this book.
I can see that. I mean, obviously, I'm not in Atlanta. I'm not you. I'm not these families, but I was very invested in how things went for them. There's also another woman, an activist who you introduced us to, L.A. Pink. And I needed her as much as these families needed her. She has a perspective because she's been doing the work for a really long time. And there are churches that are involved there. I mean, there are, but she is sort of the face of mutual aid in one family in particular. But can we talk about her for a second? Because she is an amazing example of how to do the thing, right?
Absolutely. I needed her as much as I think the reader will, because she was the source of hope. I mean, hope against all odds, this sort of indefatigable hope. And she cultivated what I think I use this term in the book to describe her. I definitely use it in describing her to friends and people now. She cultivated this kind of radical availability. She was just available. And that's something that even like the most committed caseworkers or volunteers often aren't, therapists, because they need to for good reasons, have boundaries. Pink, LA Pink, I call her Pink. She actively destroyed the boundaries that would have insulated her from the pain that people were experiencing. And I think I needed her also just, I mean, even apart from what ended up in the book, I just needed her because like she was there when like I was having to navigate constantly. Do I intervene in this moment? Do I help? In what way? How do I help without manipulating the very thing I'm supposed to be writing about and documenting? But Pink was there. Pink was there. She was the one making the decisions. Like, I'm going to bring them food. I'm going to give them gas money. I'm going to give them the ride to this job interview or to meet with the caseworker or whatever. And she was so the same availability, radical availability she showed the people she's working with, she showed to me, and she just allowed me to like track with her. And so during the pandemic, like we were just together constantly. So a lot of those scenes in the book, like Pink is there in the background, I'm there in the background, but she was just a constant. She was kind of my Virgil in understanding this terrain.
I want to talk about ethics for a second. Journalism does have a code of ethics. I mean, you've just mentioned it there. Like, where do I intervene? What's legit? I mean, years ago, there was rather something of a controversy. There was a very famous prize-winning photo of a child dying of starvation in Ethiopia. Yes. And lots of folks felt that the photographer should have done something because there was a refugee camp not far away, and everyone was arguing, pick up the child, take the child. And he said, well, actually, I can't. And I understand both sides of it, and I'm just glad it wasn't me in his shoes. But there is a code of ethics. You do have to think about, how am I reporting this story? It does mean you have to put a piece of yourself in a box.
Yeah.
And it's hard.
Yeah, it is. And there's I'm really unsatisfied with kind of the pat answers to that question.
Yeah.
You know, newsrooms like the New York Times have policies that their reporters have to abide by.
Yep.
And those policies seem, I mean, you need guidelines, but the policies themselves are like ridiculous in a way, right? Like you can't pay your sources for an interview, but you can take them out to a nice lunch. Like if you're, Andrea Elliot, I think, uses this example. Like you can, if you're writing about a stock trader, you can take them out to a lunch on Wall Street, but you can't let them pay for it. Like you pay for it yourself. If you're writing about a family who is experiencing food insecurity and is like acutely hungry, taking them out to a restaurant is a way of, I mean, you're effectively like, why is that different than paying them? So there's a lot of kind of arbitrariness to these rules. There's a lot of, I think often like we are so fixated on money, on like not paying people or receiving money or something, you know, but knowledge is also a resource. And in the process of reporting this book, there were many times where I was like, you know, I became very, very familiar, to put it mildly, with like the world of homeless services and how to access resources and what to say and what not to say and what numbers to call and who to leave a message, all sorts of sort of techniques for navigating the system. And there were points where me sharing that knowledge could have been more decisive than giving someone $200 or $300. And there were moments where I shared information and it was ignored. And it was, you know, so sometimes we imagine ourselves as journalists having this kind of power, this kind of godlike power, like if I decide to intervene, things will change. Like, and sometimes that's not even the case. Like, sometimes your influence is less decisive than you would like to believe it is. So it's a really, really fraught question. And the way that I handled it was just telling people up front, like, I can't give you big sums of money. Like, I just can't. And they were okay with that. Like they understood that. And there were other people sort of in the mix, like LA Pink, who were able to give money, or who were able to guide people to this organization or that who could help you avoid losing your room at this hotel with a short-term assistance. But having said that, it was a struggle, and it was hard, and I don't trust any reporter or scholar, researcher writing about these issues for whom this isn't attention, and for whom like this isn't, or not even attention, like where this doesn't keep them up at night.
Context is the thing that I think we're missing in so many of our conversations now, right? It's everyone sort of retreated to their corners, and context is what's missing. And you give us context without being overwhelming. I don't want people to think that you've written a history book or that you've written something. I never felt like I was being handed a polemic. I felt like I was really invested in the people. Mm. And even there's a manager that we meet at one of the extended stay hotels, and I'm like, I can't imagine how terrible your life is either, because you are meeting pain and fear and anxiety with a little bit of an attitude that probably is not helping you and is not helping them. And, of course, it's easy to say I'm sitting in a lovely studio and, I'm not living in an extended stay hotel, but watching how people respond to each other. Mm-hmm. And not having cultural clues or context clues or nuance, mm-hmm. right? We live in an era now where everything is one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I so appreciate you saying that, because I have kind of an allergy, I think, to like beautifully reported and written reportage that just leaves it at that, like where at the end you're just kind of like, well, who's to say what led them to become homeless? Like, it's so textured, and texture is great, nuance is great, detail is great, but it's also important to understand, like, what was it that led them to be in the situation to begin with? And so it has to be both. There has to be a framing. There has to be a conviction, I think, on the part of the writer, a moral conviction, a political conviction that doesn't fall prey to the fallacy that all you're doing is following people and watching what they do. Sometimes there's this kind of self-imposed tunnel vision, and I don't understand that.
I want to go back to something you said, where the 5 families you follow, they're not actually counted in the annual homeless census because they are not, in fact, considered homeless. And the numbers matter, right? And we spend all of this time as a culture trying to sort of tamp down these numbers or not report all of them. And, you say it, I think you might say it in the epilogue, actually, where you're just like, well, if the numbers didn't matter, why are we trying so hard to hide them? Mm-hmm. Right. And now, obviously, there's the eviction lab at Princeton run by Matthew Desmond and his team there. There are a couple of other academic programs that are looking into this as well. But the idea that somehow the data is incomplete, and yes, it is, but we need to change. I want to spend some time with this, because we're doing ourselves a disservice by not getting all of the information.
For sure. Yes. And so I was shocked to discover that the actual number of people, overwhelmingly families with children, who are homeless right now in this country is a conservative estimate, around 6 times bigger than the official figure. And the official figure, I believe, most recently was about like close to 750,000 men, women, and children homeless. That's the official count. And so we're talking about like 6 times larger than that. Here in Atlanta, if all of the people who were excluded just from the official count in Georgia were to all gather in a stadium, they would fill the Brave Stadium 3 times over. And those are just the people who are excluded. So it's a vast, we're not talking about like, oh, a couple of people here and there. We're talking about a lot of people. And where are these people? They are in their cars. They are doubled up, tripled up with friends, coworkers, relatives, often in very precarious housing situations, where the people they're staying with are in precarious situations and are like on the brink of eviction in many cases. They are living in these awful hotels, and I mean, I know awful is to put a commentary on it, but the hotels that I'm writing about, they are effectively like extremely profitable homeless shelters that are absolutely proliferating across the country. And here in Georgia, you drive down the street, you could pass 10, 11 of these low budget economy hotels. They're actually more expensive than an apartment would be next door. We pass by these places and we don't realize there are families living here not for months but years. Like school buses pull up to these hotels and pick up school children. People have these hotel addresses on their driver's license. They are trapped in these places. An author who has made a big impact on me, Jonathan Kozol, his book Rachel and Her Children from the 80s, he described this towering shelter in New York as like a refugee camp for those who are kind of the casualties of, I think he called it economic warfare in America. And I think these extended stay hotels are similar. They and so this vast population has been rendered invisible. It's not just that they're hidden, it's not just that they're invisible, it's they've been rendered invisible. This has been an engineered neglect. And I think it's important to foreground that when talking about the numbers.
There are examples of places, though, that have been able to address crises like these. Finland, Vienna, both are used as examples. And I want to go there for a second. And yes, there will be people who will say, well, that's outside of the States. However, I think the examples work. I think we all agree that there's a lack of housing in America now. We need to look at the way we zone. We need to look at the way we use land. There are a million different things that we need to look at as a culture and a society. But we do have examples of ways that we might be able to focus on as a model. So do we start with Vienna or do we start with Finland?
I think Finland is great. Vienna, I mean, what they're both doing, what they have in common is, first of all, they're saying the solution to homelessness. I mean, Finland had a homelessness problem of their own. And what Finland said is, like, the leaders in Finland were like, the way you solve homelessness is by giving people homes. Like, a radical idea. The reason people are homeless is because they don't have a home. They don't have a place to live. And so Finland really was at the forefront of implementing what's called housing first. It's a paradigm that says you don't wait for people to be housing ready. That's kind of the term that was used in the world of homeless services. You don't wait for them to be ready for housing, which usually meant like going through rehab, undergoing mental health treatment, whatever it was, to be ready, to have a place to live. You give people a place to live, and that's the ground upon which a life can be built, and that stability can be found, and whatever the individual needs are. So Finland implemented that, but the way they implemented that was they started building what's called social housing on government-owned land, and which, social housing is not this outlandish idea. We may think it is because we've forgotten what public housing was supposed to be in America. Public housing emerged in America in the midst of the Depression, and just like today, there was a crisis of a huge number of people who just needed a place to live, a state, not slum-like conditions, but safe, stable housing. And the government said, we're going to provide that housing. And of course, it was shot through with racism. Only public housing was originally intended for white families, working families, not the poorest among us, and not, in many cases, Black or minority families. But the idea was like the government is going to step up, make a major investment, and ensure that people have homes. And if public housing hadn't been allowed to fall into disrepair and effectively abandoned in the 80s, the Reagan administration said, we're getting out of the housing business, period. And that was the culmination of many years of just neglecting the housing needs of Americans. And people were basically left to fend for themselves in the private market. This kind of survival of the fittest mentality, or what one caseworker in the book calls the housing hunger games. That's what people were thrown into. Finland, Vienna, other of America's peer countries have said we're going to treat housing as just like a basic human necessity, the way that like education or healthcare is a basic human necessity. And we're going to make sure that as many people have that as possible. And that means removing as much as we can the profit motive in allowing people to have a secure place to live.
Which sits right there with, kids being able to eat breakfast and lunch at school, regardless of their parents' income. I mean, you can't learn when you're hungry. It's just,
or when you don't know where you're going to be sleeping at night after you get home from school. Yeah.
And it just perpetuates a cycle that is unnecessary.
And preventable.
Totally
preventable.
I'm really glad I met these families. I'm really glad I sat with the book. You write a very propulsive narrative. So before I let you go, I do want to talk about literary influences, because I am so not surprised when you said I was an anthropologist first. I'm like, oh, yeah. Okay, I get that. But the way the book is structured and the way you gave me space to sit with a lot of emotion and a lot of narrative tension, and knowing also that this is actually happening. You have not made up a word. I just want to talk about the craft for a second, because again, you worked with actually 5 years if you look at all of the reporting, but significant on the ground day to day, 3 years.
Yeah. It was.
How do you structure that into a story that doesn't overwhelm the people you're writing about?
I would love to present myself as like this maverick literary genius who structured this book like in isolation. I have to say, like, when I came out of the reporting, or even in the midst of the reporting, I was completely overwhelmed. I could not see the forest for the trees. It was so visceral and so immediate. And so much of the task in my reporting was I knew I wanted to convey that visceral, immediate quality to readers. I wanted them to feel this in a very sort of gut punch kind of way. But that is sometimes at odds with like this smooth structure and like a propulsive read. And I just have to sing the praises of my editor, Amanda Cook. Amanda converted me to the religion of not just an outline, but like the most rigorous outlining process imaginable. And I'm now an evangelist for that religion. Someone asked me recently, a writer friend, they're like, so are you into outlining? And I was like, I don't know. When you go on like a day-long hike, do you like a trail? Do you like to have a trail? And it's like, I now see how crucial it was, but I didn't always see it. After I finished the reporting, I was so ready to start writing. And I actually went to Boston, where my editor, Amanda, lives. And I thought she had said, we're going to outline the book like together. And I was like, so I was imagining like an afternoon and we throw together kind of a rough outline. And then I start writing the book and I'm done. That ended up being a meeting in person, talking about what the outlining process would entail. And I was like stunned. I was like, wait, what do you mean I'm going to spend months? She didn't say months, but it ended up being months putting together a structure. But in retrospect, that work of doing an entire draft of an outline and a structure, and then like getting revisions on that draft and on that out, like, was totally invaluable. And, it was really together that we were just like, okay, what goes where? And how do we make readers feel invested in these individual stories that are so difficult? How do we not just hit them over the head on every page with misery? Because that's what it felt like in the reporting often. And, part of the gambit of the book is that readers will stick through like the opening part one, where the families are relatively like stable and it's kind of mundane, like what we see them doing. There isn't like a ton of drama in that first part of the book. And the point is, there's a moral point there that like we shouldn't just try to capture people in their most anguished moments, as so much reporting and research on poverty tends to do, just this kind of misery porn. We should show people in the fullness of who they are. We should show them laughing with their kids and like making Christmas Eve dinner and playing games and building gingerbread houses and, being romantic with each other, whatever it is, and not just show them like in this moment of crisis. But I think that in narrative terms, like a reader can only appreciate the magnitude of what befalls these families because you've witnessed what life was like and could be like for them before this happened. And so all of those questions were structural questions, and it was hard. It was a very long process of of finding the families, reporting, but then just even getting to the point where I could begin writing and having a structure that felt true and effective was so important, and it was so collaborative with my editor. And I just want to push against the idea that when people compliment me on this book, I'm like, Amanda, this is a compliment for you too, because she was just brilliant and amazing. So
it all comes back to collaboration and community and the fact that none of us can do this alone.
Yes. Including writers.
Right.
Especially writers.
You would do this again. You would do this again in this way, it sounds like to me. I mean, this is not a story you regret telling. This is not time you regret reporting. That this is the thing that you knew you were going to be able to do.
It's so easy for this to sound trite and just a platitude, but like, if I had known how hard it was going to be, I don't know that I would have done it. Like, it was,
okay.
I mean, it was definitely like a lot of having people around me, my spouse, my kids, people who love me, Pink, who's in the book, editor, so many, a therapist, a good therapist. That helped certainly, but it was really, really hard. And I poured every ounce of my being into this, and I would do it knowing what the outcome was, knowing that how important it is to the families themselves that their stories are told and that they're not just reduced to these caricatures. Like, that was really important to them. And I think it was a way for them to exercise some of the internalized shame and judgment that had been put on them. So like, for all those reasons, and to just like push the conversation about housing in this country forward, like, because we need a paradigm shift. And that's kind of where my passion is right now. Yeah.
You and I could keep going for hours and hours and hours, and maybe we should take this on the road. But in the meantime, I'm going to say, Brian Goldstone, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. There Is No Place for Us is out now. And really, Evicted, Matthew Desmond, Invisible Child, Andrea, Elliot, Brian's sitting right there with them. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.